Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. Do you relentlessly strive towards perfection and deep down know that your self-worth is so wrapped up with needing to surpass your high standards that any time you don't meet these standards, it feels like a crushing failure and leads you to not feel good enough? If so, then this episode is for you. I am your host, Dr. Liz White, consultant clinical psychologist, and today I am joined by Natalie Englander, aka the Perfectionism Therapist on Instagram. Natalie is an award-winning senior cognitive behavioural therapist and coach, and having spent the last 12 years working in an NHS deputy clinical lead role, she now focuses on her private practice full-time and specialises in perfectionism, offering therapy, coaching and mindfulness to perfectionists alongside clinical supervision and business coaching for therapists. In this episode, Natalie and I unpack how perfectionism isn't just about high standards, it's also about self-worth, it's about black and white thinking, and often a lifetime of striving for unobtainable perfection. We explore how therapy can open the door to being good enough and why the mindset shift to done is better than perfect can be a game changer. From self-compassion to cognitive behavioural techniques, we discuss how to manage perfectionistic thinking and behaviour. So let's dive in. So welcome, Natalie, to the Hello Therapy podcast. I'm so pleased that you're here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Can't wait to talk about perfectionism, and yeah, it's my favourite topic to talk about, of course.
Brilliant. Yeah, I thought we could think about sort of perfectionism as a whole in terms of trying to understand it so that anyone that's listening will hopefully by the end of the episode have a better idea of what it is and the signs to look for and how they can help themselves if they are noticing that they're being particularly perfectionistic. So shall we dive into the first question? So how can someone tell if they are a bit perfectionistic or maybe experiencing perfectionism? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I often find that there are two types of perfectionists. There's the ones that absolutely know they're a perfectionist and they say it and they tell people, I'm a perfectionist. And then there's the ones who I think haven't yet realised that they're a perfectionist, or they often think things like, there's no way I could be a perfectionist because I'm just so far from perfect. And then they, I guess, don't sort of think of it any further. So I always find that really interesting with my clients that I see in therapy. It tends to be those two types.
Okay.
But I guess in terms of how someone can tell if they're a perfectionist, I think a good place to start is thinking about high standards. Although not everyone with high standards is a perfectionist. And for me, I think the difference is when the high standards are really unrelenting. So a perfectionist would relentlessly strive for these extremely high standards, and they're standards that are often quite unreasonable as well. They're usually quite personally demanding, put a lot of pressure on themselves and their lives. And I think as well, the difference between someone who just has high standards versus someone who is a perfectionist is a perfectionist will usually judge their self-worth based on their ability to meet all of these standards. But interestingly, I find that one again is sometimes people aren't always aware of that's what's happening. It can be quite unconscious sometimes. And yeah, I guess absolutely, for perfectionists, there are quite a lot of negative consequences of trying to reach these high standards. But you're a perfectionist when you can't help yourself. You keep going, even if it's having a really big negative impact on your life.
Yeah, and that's definitely what I've found in my work in terms of, as you say, people sometimes just not having that awareness of the impact of their self-esteem and their self-worth on their behavior. And what can show up a lot is a real fear of failure, can't it? And
Mm,
just a constant sense of I never meet these standards, I never meet these expectations. And there can be a perceived sense of it's not just internal expectations and standards, it's also what you feel externally in terms of what other people are expecting of you as well, can't it?
yeah, definitely. I guess a, a lot of the perfectionists I see, the high standards are usually linked to themselves, um, but also I see lots of perfectionists where we're working on the high standards that they have for other people as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then those that really struggle with the expectations that they feel others are placing on them. And sometimes that can be um, really quite difficult for someone because it just feeds into all of that stuff. You mentioned the fear of failure,
Mm,
um, fear of rejection is often quite common, I find, in perfectionists as well.
yeah.
Um, so people just find themselves pushing themselves so hard to meet all of these standards. Um, and most of the time, people might find that they are meeting the standards, but they don't feel good about it, or they don't then feel content. They kind of raise the
Mm-hmm.
bar higher,
Yeah.
and just keep striving. Or on the other side, someone can keep feeling like they're not meeting their standards and they're failing, and then
Mm-hmm.
they can fall into struggling with low mood and self criticism
Mm,
and feeling rubbish about themselves. Um, so it can be quite a tricky cycle where you sort of don't win either way. You either
right.
don't meet your standards and feel rubbish, or you do meet your standards, but it doesn't feel that great anyway, and you still keep
Yeah.
working extra hard.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that idea of like the goalposts keep moving, right, in terms of your
Yeah,
standards. And
yeah,
it can really impact on mental health, can't it? As you say, that never feeling good enough. Um, it and that's a really tough place to be, isn't it? When anything that
mm,
you do just isn't good enough, you feel. Um,
yeah,
and I mean, there's so much research now that shows there's a really strong link between this type of perfectionism and mental health difficulties like anxiety and low mood and depression and things.
yeah. That's
Do you?
why it's so important to be able to recognize if you're a perfectionist or not, if you're struggling with
Yeah.
perfectionism, because if you are, it's important that you look after yourself and
Hmm.
work on the perfectionism, because yeah, as you say, it can be linked to lots of mental health problems. Eating disorders,
Hmm.
it's really common.
Yeah.
OCD,
Hmm.
generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety. So yeah, it's definitely important to try and spot it if
Yeah.
it is there.
To spot it, and then once you're aware of it, you can do something about it, can't you?
Yeah.
From your experience of working with perfectionists, what would you say is at the core of perfectionism in terms of what tends to keep it going? Would you say is the kind of main thing?
Yeah. I think definitely that low self worth
Mm,
can be a big part of it. Um, but I often find that for lots of perfectionists, that doesn't really resonate with them initially. It's not until you
okay.
start exploring things in therapy and really get to the root of things that maybe you then identify that perhaps your self worth is on the lower side.
Mm,
Um, because for some perfectionists, things can be going pretty well a lot of the time. Yes, you're exhausted, maybe you're burnt out and you can't relax or switch off, um, but you kind of feel like life's going okay and you're
Yeah.
doing all the things that you want to be doing. So the idea of having low self-worth can feel quite strange.
Yeah.
And we think, on the surface, I've done X, Y, Z, that's great. Um, but sometimes deep down underneath, there can be a difficulty with low self-worth, and it can be
Mm-hmm.
quite unconscious. Um, and definitely just generally having negative beliefs about yourself. So not feeling like you're good enough or feeling like you're a failure can certainly also be at the core of perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I guess what I've noticed since specializing in perfectionism and seeing so many perfectionists in therapy, I often find not applicable to everyone, but if and when we explore someone's early experiences and what their
Mm-hmm.
childhood was like, I certainly see a theme or a pattern of someone's emotional needs having not been met in childhood. Um, so whether that might look like um, parents being quite critical or not allowing room for expressing your emotions or not being
Mm-hmm.
shown love in a certain way. And so I think I see quite a lot of perfectionists who start as parent pleasers in childhood.
Right.
They want to do well to make mum and dad happy, so they're happy with them and they show them love, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then often a parent pleaser turns into a people pleaser in adulthood as well. So I
Yeah.
think that's why we often see a big overlap of a, a large majority of
Mm.
perfectionists also being people pleasers as well.
And so growing up in that way, yes, it means that there's what develops then, as you say, is that sense of I have to do certain things in order to be an okay person or to be good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I think, when you get to school and you're doing exams and things, and perhaps you're then working really hard to get the good grades so that you get that reinforcement of, oh, you're really good at this and you're really good at that.
Yeah.
And I think that can often fuel these type of beliefs, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that can apply the striving for good exam results and things in school, even if you haven't had that experience of your emotional needs not being met.
Yeah.
Perhaps you've had a really lovely, good childhood,
Mm-hmm.
but positive reinforcement is powerful.
Yeah.
And if we do well at something, it feels good, and we often want more of that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's not even about receiving that positive praise from parents or teachers. It can just feel good for yourself,
Yeah.
um, and and then you find yourself putting more pressure on yourself to perform well, even if no one else is
Mm.
putting that pressure on you.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing to say, isn't it? Like you don't have to have a really tricky childhood
Mm,
with parents who were self-critical like that. That is common with perfectionism, but it can also be, as you say, you could have had an absolutely lovely childhood, but there's a particular element of growing up that meant that you developed some beliefs about your worth in relation to um, particular behaviors or standards, as you say. And
mm,
if I think also if you go into a career that where you have to kind of work hard and you're in competition with other people in terms of being at
yeah,
uni and then in the job market, I think that can then fuel it as well. And I work in the city of London, so I'm sort of right in the centre of all the banks and the law firms and things. So
yeah,
I do tend to see that a lot. These really high functioning individuals who who have done very well and very successful and have achieved a lot. But sometimes that comes at a real cost to their,
Mm,
not only their kind of physical health, but their mental health, in terms of what they feel they need to continue to do. And as you mentioned,
yeah.
burnout, that's definitely a thing that I see a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to that question around how can people tell that they're a perfectionist, it's the ones that just can't seem to not do it, or who can't seem to um, take a step back and let some of
Mm,
those standards go. They still keep striving despite the huge cost to them.
yeah.
Um, and that's where I think when you asked about what keeps it going, um, I think, yes, low self worth can definitely play a role in things, but often it's fear. So whether it's fear of
Mm,
failure, fear of rejection, fear of being criticized, not being liked, being judged, not being good enough. And sometimes that pressure just goes up and up the more successful you are as well, because you feel like you
absolutely.
need to keep the good stuff going.
Yeah.
And it would feel quite terrifying to make a mistake and be
Mm,
criticized, or make a mistake and for someone to think that you're not good enough and judge you
yeah.
in some way.
And I think if you add in, I don't know, if you're in a particular work culture, maybe a toxic work culture that
Mm,
uh, really leads you to feel like you have to be working a lot, you have to be working out of hours, you have to work very late, because everyone else is doing that. If you're a perfectionist
yeah,
and you've got all this stuff going on for you internally, um, that is going to take its toll eventually. Because we're not robots, we
yeah,
can't sustain that level for very long.
yeah, definitely. I think burnout is often a really big problem for perfectionists. Um, and I think that's why it's so important as well to work on managing your perfectionism, because otherwise, I think you can tend to see just cycles throughout different periods of your life
Yeah,
where you get burnt out.
absolutely. So, what would you say is we think about the sort of styles of thinking, or the patterns of thinking that perfectionists tend to get into, because that is one factor, isn't it, that can maintain that sense of
Yeah.
not good enough and I've got to keep striving. What do you tend to see with people you work with?
Yeah. So there's definitely a few of them that come up a lot. Probably the biggest one I see is black and white thinking, or all
Yeah.
or nothing thinking.
Mm,
So this idea that it's either perfect or it's rubbish. I've either done amazing or I failed. And perfectionists can often struggle to see or be with the shades of grey in the middle. Things are just very black and white. And that can also apply not just to standards that you have for yourselves, but the perfectionists that struggle with placing really high standards or unrealistic expectations on other people. That black
hmm.
and white thinking can show up there as well. They either care about me or they don't. They've
Yeah.
either done something right or it's wrong. So that's probably the biggest one I see. I don't
Yeah.
think I've ever met a perfectionist without all or nothing thinking. Um,
I think I would say the same, actually. Definitely. It's
yeah,
such I feel it's such a big part of the perfectionist experience, because I think it also links with the kind of rules that someone might have. So,
mm,
it's either this or it's that, and therefore I must or I should do this thing this way, and that's the
yeah,
only way that I can do it. It's either about me, I don't know, getting a first at university, or there was no point doing the degree.
yeah,
So I
yeah. That's a
must
great
work
example.
extra hard. I must work extra hard. I must, put 60 hours a week into my studying in order to get a first. So it all
Mm,
sort of links up, doesn't it, to you have that main sort of narrative in your mind, and that then filters down to how you feel you think you should be and what you should do.
yeah, definitely. And saying the word should, that's another really common one.
Yeah.
The shoulds and the musts. I should always get 100%. I must never fail. Um, and that can often lead into self criticism. That's usually a big part of perfectionism as well, criticizing yourself
Yeah.
when things don't go well, or even when they do go well, maybe then you discount those positives and you think,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it
Yeah.
was just a fluke, or I just got lucky. Um, so, yeah, I think perfectionists can really struggle with the way that they think about things and can often have quite
Mm.
unhelpful thinking styles that we need to work on in therapy.
Yeah, and what that means for someone is if you can't really appreciate your successes and your achievements because it's never good enough, it's never reached the level that you think you should reach, then you're constantly disappointed. You're constantly
Mm,
sort of not able to feel good about yourself or your achievements.
yeah,
And as you say, it's so common that inner critic, that self-critical voice comes in a lot. It comes in so much, you know, telling you that you're not doing good enough. You've got to do better. Um, and that is a really tough way to live, isn't it?
yeah, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder why so many perfectionists struggle with procrastination, because when you've just got this constant pressure placed on yourself, sometimes it's just too much.
Mm,
And we will then put things off or avoid things because that feels better in that moment, or the pressure is just too high that we'd rather not start it at all. Maybe we'd rather just not do it,
mm,
because if we're not certain we're going to do something well, then we just won't do it,
yeah.
because the fear of failure is too great.
Yeah.
um, and I think that's why, again, I feel like it's so important to work on some of this stuff in therapy if you are a perfectionist, even if you aren't currently experiencing a diagnosable mental health problem. So you don't have depression, or you're not experiencing generalized anxiety disorder, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Being a perfectionist still has a huge impact on your life.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, it doesn't need to be that way. There are other ways to
Mm.
to do things.
So when you are working with perfectionists, what would you say, or how does it look in terms of the therapy? What would you be focusing on in terms of how to change some of this stuff? I
Yeah.
appreciate that's a really broad question.
No, it's fine. I think, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is probably that it completely depends on the client, and I guess their goals as
Mm,
well. So I might see one perfectionist who's struggling with feeling really overwhelmed, and procrastination is causing really big problems in their life. Or
okay.
I might see another perfectionist who is feeling so anxious all the time and they're overthinking and worrying a lot. Um, or I might see the ones who are really struggling with their relationships because they've got these very high standards for other people, and it's causing problems with their friendships or romantic relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, coming back to someone's goals as well, sometimes people want to keep things more practical and kind of learn tools and techniques, whereas others maybe want to get to the root of things more. So I'm kind of led, I guess, by what it is that the client I'm working with is wanting to work on and
Yeah.
get out of the sessions. But generally, um, usually start off with, I guess, an assessment where we're
Mm-hmm.
um, learning about how their perfectionism shows up, trying to make sense of the difficulties, get a sense of what's going on, what's keeping the problems going. And we'd always look to develop a formulation together, which is where we're just trying to get a really good picture of what's led to the development of their perfectionism and what's maintaining it, I guess.
Yeah.
And that in itself, I find, is so helpful and so powerful for people, because even before we then dive into looking at making positive changes to the things that they're struggling with, just having that understanding and that greater awareness of what's actually happening,
Yeah.
I think is so useful. You kind of get that relief of like, it makes sense that I'm doing this, or it makes sense that I'm thinking that way.
Yeah.
And I think that can help you have a little bit more compassion for yourself, which perfectionists are not very good at being compassionate towards themselves. And then, in terms of then what we'd look at or work on in therapy next, is I often like that onion analogy, where we kind of start on the surface, on the outside of the onion, so tackling more of the everyday stuff, whether that's negative thinking or worrying, procrastination, anxiety, etc. And then peeling off, getting into the next layer of the onion. And that's usually working on someone's rules or assumptions that they have, that they try to live by. Because for perfectionists, there are often loads and loads. That's one of my favorite things to help someone with as a therapist, is seeing if we can create a bit more flexibility with the standards and the rules that they're living by. And then I guess getting to the core of the onion is often working on someone's beliefs that they hold about themselves, or that low self-worth that might be there as well.
And as a cognitive behavioral therapist, do you mainly help people challenge their thoughts, or do you use any other kind of strategies to help them?
Yeah, so again, for me, it often depends on the client and what might feel most helpful for them. And some of that can also depend on if they've had therapy before or not, what's worked or hasn't worked. But yeah, there definitely might be some working on challenging thoughts in a more traditional CBT way. But I'm also a mindfulness teacher, and I offer compassion focused therapy as well. So I'm often weaving lots of that into therapy too, which I think works really nicely for perfectionists and can give you another way of managing things, or of looking at things as well.
I've really found that in my work as well, because I mainly use acceptance and commitment therapy and compassion focused therapy in my work. So it's kind of working at the skills level, isn't it? Like, you, up to this point, these thoughts, these beliefs, these assumptions, these rules have dictated what you do. And actually now we've started to peel the onion. We've got a really good formulation. We've got good eyes on what the problem is. You're in a great position now to start changing some of this stuff. So not just changing the behaviors, like, the working 24/7 or whatever it is, but also let's have a different relationship with the thoughts, with the beliefs. Let's try and step back from them and notice when they're showing up and when they are trying to run the show.
Yeah, I often talk about that idea of when our perfectionism can get out of control or start controlling us. And that it's really important to be managing your perfectionism so that it isn't controlling your life. And yeah, I actually remember when I was doing my mindfulness teacher training, um, there's a day where it's a day of silence. And I
Right.
remember approaching this day as a perfectionist myself, feeling like, right, this needs to be amazing. I need to have these great insights, looking around, everyone else sat there silently, thinking, God, they're all probably having this fantastic, amazing time. And I was just sat there like, God, I'm not sure this is helping. What's this all about, etc. And then right at the end, I had this moment where I wasn't kind of there actively thinking about or trying to work on my perfectionism, but I had this insight and moment where I realized, I don't actually have to respond or do anything with my perfectionistic type thoughts of, you need to do this or this needs to be perfect, etc. I thought I can just let them be there, and
Mm.
that's fine. Kind of label them almost like, oh, here's
Yeah.
the you need to do this perfectly thought. Great, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Have a nice day. Um, and yeah, I guess that's what I love about um, being a CBT therapist, is that there are different approaches within that you can use depending
Yeah.
on what's going to be helpful for your client.
And that can be transformative, can't it? Like knowing that you don't have to listen to your thoughts,
Mm,
that you can just let them come and go, and you get to choose what you do.
yeah.
And I think for me that's often like almost that can be a real light bulb moment in therapy is, oh, okay, so I don't have to listen to everything that my mind tells me.
Mm,
Um, and I think when you're a perfectionist and there's that self criticism as well, you're so used to just, going with what your mind says, going with what the inner critic
yeah.
says, whatever the inner critic says, if, you're being rubbish at this, you're not good enough at this, you just believe that to be true. And I think
Mm,
in therapy, you can step out of that and go, oh, okay, this is what's happening. This is the process of my thinking right now.
yeah.
But what do I want to do? What do I choose? And
Mm,
that's what your
yeah.
experience there was, wasn't it? Being able to go, oh, okay, thanks, mind, move on.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's always one of the things I talk about if I do bring in mindfulness into our sessions, is this idea that we can, using mindfulness, learn how to respond rather than react. Because often we
Yeah.
do just react in these habitual, automatic ways without even thinking. We're kind of just on autopilot doing things, the inner critic says something and we just react and we feel rubbish or we go and work harder.
Mm,
Whereas we can learn to have that moment of pause in between to then choose how we want to respond. And sometimes the outcome might look the same, but at
yeah.
least we've had that choice and awareness over how we're responding to something, I guess.
Mm. And would you say that you notice that perfectionism shows up in the therapy room? Like what have you noticed over
Mm,
the years?
yeah. So it's funny actually when you say what have I noticed over the years, it just instantly made me think about how back in the day when I first qualified as a CBT therapist, I remember I didn't actually enjoy working with perfectionists because being newly qualified, you've probably got less confidence, more anxiety, more imposter
Yeah.
syndrome, um, and perfectionists can have high standards. And I remember seeing a couple of perfectionists and feeling like, oh God, you know, they're expecting so much, and I don't know if I know what I'm doing. Um,
Yeah.
and then, yeah, I guess also some of that as well. When you're a perfectionist yourself, if you haven't worked on things, you might relate to things a bit too much.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think I've had a nice journey with that over time where I've now got to a place where, of course, I love working with perfectionists. I love the challenge. If someone comes in with super high standards for me, that's great, that's fine. I'm feeling kind of confident and competent, I can help them. Um, and also having worked on my own perfectionism as well, I think that helps um, feel like I can really understand some of
Yeah.
the things that they'll be working on, not just as a therapist, but as a human, knowing how difficult some of these things are. And that probably puts me in a better position to spot if and when it's kind of playing out
Yeah.
in therapy. So, a big part of CBT is doing home practice, so helpful
Hmm.
therapeutic tasks in between the sessions where you can put the stuff you're learning into practice. Um, and you might see that either someone hasn't done it at all because they just felt like they weren't going to be able to do it perfectly, so they've avoided and procrastinated, or the other end of the scale where
Yeah.
they've come back and they've just put hours and hours into making their thought record really detailed and nicely presented. And yeah, I guess there are lots of different ways it can
Mm.
show up in therapy, I think.
I've definitely been there as well, like in terms of feeling, particularly as a in my early career, um, really, yeah, feeling the pressure sometimes in the sessions to do a good session and to be a good
Yeah,
therapist. And nowadays, I actually sort of quite like it when I notice perfectionism coming into the therapeutic relationship, because it's an opportunity to bring it up and to say, look, I've noticed this,
definitely.
or I'm curious about this. And what you said there about this needs to be a good session, or you need to get something out of this session. Let's
Yeah,
think about that in terms of what we were talking about last week. So
yeah,
it can be really, it is really helpful to bring that in. And I think it helps someone feel more understood. And I think it also helps build that rapport and that trust, doesn't it,
mm,
between
yeah,
you.
yeah, definitely. I think I often see it as well right at the beginning of therapy is that understandably someone wants kind of tools and techniques
Yeah.
straight away, instantly. And I completely get that, especially if you are really struggling with, anxiety or low mood. You just want something
Sure.
to help straight away. Um, and yeah, similar to you, I might have that conversation um, about needing to maybe allow themselves the time to get comfortable with me
Yeah.
and talking about things and making sense of what's happening first before we dive straight in with learning tools and techniques. Because sometimes I find it's not just coming from a place of I'm really struggling and I want something to help me right now, which makes complete sense. Um, but it can also come from a place of I want to be doing well in therapy,
Yeah.
and kind of placing pressure on themselves almost to be performing well and
Yeah.
becoming um, less of a perfectionist week by week as the sessions go on,
Mm.
and kind of yeah wanting the progress to look like this,
Yeah.
where they're achieving kind of they're getting a
Right.
gold star for therapy.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, it can be really difficult because therapy doesn't look like that. It often is
No.
those steps forwards backwards, but
Yeah.
gradually making your way over. um, and yeah, I guess as a perfectionist myself, I get all that stuff, but yeah, I think it's
Mm.
helpful to just name it and talk about it if it's coming up.
Yeah. So, what would you say if someone who's listening, who's sort of really resonating with all the things that we're talking about, what is it that someone could do to help themselves if
Mm,
they're not in therapy? What would you say to that?
yeah, I guess I would definitely encourage. therapy, but of course it's not for everyone.
Yeah.
And if not, that's fine. And there absolutely are things you can do for yourself. So for me, one thing would be building self-awareness. I think that
Mm-hmm.
is always key. So noticing when, where, and how your perfectionism shows up. So you might do that through journaling, can be
Yeah.
a good idea to help with building self-awareness, or practicing mindfulness so you can get better at noticing how you're feeling,
Mm-hmm.
what you're thinking in particular moments, to try and spot any perfectionistic thoughts or behaviors happening. And I guess developing practical strategies to live your life as a perfectionist. So it might be reading a self-help book on overcoming procrastination or
Mm-hmm.
managing your anxiety. I know we've mentioned self-worth, so I think working on your self-esteem is
Yeah.
helpful. I mean, you could do that in lots of different ways, but maybe a simple, easy way is to practice noticing the good things about yourself. Although I say easy, obviously that is quite
Mm.
hard for a
Tricky. Yeah.
perfectionist, but something you could try and practice on a daily
Yeah.
basis. Um, and I guess another thing that's easier said than done is self-compassion, trying to be
Yeah.
kinder to yourself. Um, I always say a good tip for that is to try and treat yourself how you treat someone you loved. And I guess in terms of the mindset that a perfectionist might have, um, trying to create some shifts there. So maybe trying to
Mm-hmm.
take a good enough approach to everything that you do. So, you sit
Yeah.
down to do a piece of work, tell yourself, right, I'm just going to do it my version of good enough.
Yeah.
And often it's pretty good. Um,
Yeah.
because a perfectionist's high standards are like up here so
Mm-hmm.
high that their good enough version is probably lots of other people's sort of best version.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
yeah.
would definitely say the same in terms of, I think for me, it's the awareness. I think you were saying before, like it's so key, isn't it? Being able to, in the moment, recognize when this stuff is showing up.
Mm,
And even that can be a real challenge if it's, as you say, if it's habitual, it's a pattern of thinking that you're just so immersed in it, you don't realize. So
yeah.
I think, as you say, the being able to reflect on your thoughts and your feelings, like after the event, when you once if you sat down and tried to do a bit of work or an essay or something, and it's really not happening, go away from it and then come back and actually, have a sit down, just think, oh, what went on there. You're not going to be able to catch this stuff in the moment unless you're a bit more practiced at it. But yeah, that awareness is really, really key initially. And then that sort of trying to bring in a bit more of a good enough approach.
Mm,
And saying that to yourself, like it's okay. Give yourself permission to be
yeah.
good enough.
Yeah, definitely. And there's I can't remember who said this now, but there's that quote or phrase that done is better than perfect. Because
Yeah.
often for so many perfectionists, stuff doesn't get done.
Mm.
We don't even try it because we feel like it's not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
So maybe particularly for the procrastinators out there, remembering done is better than perfect.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Natalie, for being here today.
That's all right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.